you starting, Jessica? Everyone, hopefully you can hear me. Yep. Okay, so we are going to get started now. I'm Chef Jess. I'm going to hand it over to Katrina, and she's going to give us a really big presentation on the microbiome and digestive health, since that's probably where most of this occurs, based on what I thought. And so she'll teach us a lot more. I'm sure this could be like a 10 class series, but we're going to try to condense it. So enjoy, and I'll see you in a little bit with some recipes.
Great. Hi, I'm Katrina Whiteson. I'm joining you from the kitchen here at the Samueli Center for Integrative Health, together with Chef Jessica Van Roo. And that's right. Today we're going to focus on digestive health and the microbiome, which there are now 25,000 papers about this topic. So it's become a very well-researched area in the last 10 or 15 years. But I'm going to give a bit of an overview and share a few favorite stories, including a story about what happens when you withhold fiber over several generations in an experiment they did at Stanford in mice, and a story about how some of our gut microbes detoxify a molecule called oxalate and help prevent us from getting kidney stones. So there's a lot of things we can thank our microbes for, including avoiding kidney stones. So before I get too far, I want to define what a microbiome is. Microbiomes are collections of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and other microbes that live in a specific environment. So the parts of your gut that have no oxygen, the anaerobic depths of your colon support microbes that can live without oxygen. And the microbes that live in a dry part of your forearm versus a more moist part of your elbow will be very different based on the conditions. So these are ideas that microbial ecologists have been studying in environmental contexts for a century, but the human microbiome is a little bit more of a topic. In the last 10 or 20 years, we've gotten a lot more information about it. And now we know that human microbiomes correlate with a lot of health conditions like obesity, cancer, autoimmune diseases and allergies like type 1 diabetes or celiac disease or eczema or asthma. Those conditions have been increasing in the 20th century and until now. And we think that part of that has to do with how our microbiomes and our immune systems are developing, especially early in life. And even our brain chemistry and the efficacy of the vaccines that we take are impacted by the strength of our microbiomes, which impacts our immune health. So Chef Jess and I give these lectures. This series occurs once a month, and we choose a different topic each time. We share the recipes on the website, so you're welcome to look for the recipes on the website. I know they were also sent out to participants beforehand. Here we are in December, and there's still several great topics coming up throughout the year. Today's recipes include a black bean smash burger and an invisible layered apple cake. And I see all the ingredients laid out here in the kitchen. They look really good. And then we've got Chef Jess will make a date caramel sauce to go with the apples. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the science focus. And I just want to emphasize that all of us have a holobiont. And so what that means is that our genetic capabilities and metabolic capabilities are not confined to the genes that are part of our own genome. So the human genome, for example, or a fly genome as a comparison, will contain genes that can carry out all different kinds of functions. But we can expand those functions dramatically with the help of the microbes that colonize our bodies. So the concept of a holobiont is to think about the entirety or the assembly of organisms that associate for a significant part of their life history. So in the context of humans, we have microbes that have been colonizing our guts throughout human history, through the ages, for many, many, many generations. Those same bugs have been often vertically transmitted from parent to child or through families and communities. So we have these same bugs in our gut, and they're carrying out functions that really help us. We know more about some of those functions than others. There's such great diversity. We actually don't know what a lot of the microbes are doing yet, but we know what some of them are doing. And For example, the gut bugs, the colon anaerobes, they can break down fiber. That's a really important function that they're helping us do. Human enzymes cannot break down fiber, but our microbes living in our colon can. So this is the concept of a holobiont, that we are more capable than what our own genomes can do. We have the help of microbes that bring a lot of diversity that otherwise we wouldn't have those functions. And so that brings me to kind of a central thesis of our field, which is that host-associated polymicrobial communities are powerful indicators of health and disease. And so we can use the composition of our microbes as an indicator of our lifestyle and to learn about our health. It's still really a research area, and I'm going to share a recent paper with you about how we're not quite there yet in using microbiome testing as part of medical clinical decision making. But we still can use this information to learn about health in a research context. So we know that the microbiota influences human health. Aiding in digestion is one of the first things you might think of, just like Chef Jess was saying. I mean, the majority of the microbes in our microbiome live in our colon, and you can think of it like a second organ. It's like a liver. It's a huge part of our metabolic capacity, is all those microbes living in our colon. They also can help us avoid infection by competitively excluding pathogens. They have big influence on our immune development, which, correlates, as I mentioned, with cancer, obesity, and autoimmune diseases. They can even alter drug metabolism. So when you take a Tylenol, it actually turns out that the mechanism for Tylenol depends on the gut microbes as well. And every pharmaceutical actually is impacted by the microbiome. And it's really that's a very new area of research. We don't really understand how many pharmaceuticals interact with our microbiome yet. So just to make sure that I start from the beginning talking about what I mean by the gut microbiome. So I'm talking about the microbes that live in the intestine, where you have about 3 pounds of microbes. So 10 to the 9th to 10 to the 11th cells of bacteria per gram of the contents in your intestine. Most of them are anaerobes. Anaerobes refer to microbes that cannot grow in the presence of oxygen. So they live in a no oxygen environment, which is honestly pretty amazing. So microbes can live everywhere, depths of the ocean, depths of your gut with no oxygen. They have metabolisms for being able to do that. And so you have huge numbers of them, 10 to the 13 or 14 microbial cells in total. Most of the microbes in the human body are in the gut, although of course we have very densely colonized microbes in our saliva, in our dental plaque. Our skin is definitely colonized, but those numbers don't add up to nearly the density that we find in the gut. Many of those gut microbes are from a couple of phyla of bacteria, the Bacteroidetes or the Firmicutes. And so just to give a couple examples, maybe you've never heard of Bacteroidetes theta iomicron, which is an anaerobe that's one of these famous anaerobes that can break down fibers and complex carbs into products that can be absorbed by the body. So that's a very key example of aiding in digestion. Probably the gut bug most people have heard of is Escherichia coli. We abbreviate it as E. coli. It's interesting because it was one of the first bugs that got studied extensively by scientists. But it's not necessarily a majority bug. Most of the microbes in our gut are not E. coli. It is widespread. Probably most people have E. coli in their guts. It's actually really important in the context of travelers' diarrhea. The CDC global travelers research studies have shown that a lot of the travelers' diarrhea that people get is caused by E. coli. So it's an important one. There's healthy versions too, but it's certainly not the majority of our gut bugs. Another feature that I want to point out about the physiology and the anatomy of our intestine is that the cells lining our gut, the gut epithelial cells, they are some of the fastest growing cells in our body. So our cellular turnover of those cells lining the gut epithelia is really fast. And so, when you hear you are what you eat, all of the cells in our body turn over about every 7 years, but that happens much more quickly for the cells lining our gut epithelia. And so I just want that to be in your mind that we have this really fast growth going on and a lot of action in the area of the gut. And so I have this image, which to me represents how, the foods that we're eating can power our health in the sense that, we're fueling the cells in our body with the molecules coming from our foods. And so some of the best advice we have still is to eat mostly plants, make sure we get enough fiber in our diets. And this is correlated with supporting a healthy microbiome with lots of the gut anaerobes that can break down fiber, producing healthy fermentation products and promoting immune health, which there's growing studies, which I'm not going to talk about today, but if you've watched some of my other lectures, I've shared studies with you guys about how cancer treatment is much more successful when you have more fiber in your diet as a correlation, or vaccine efficacy. Your vaccine is more likely to promote healthy immunity when you have fiber in your diet. So if you consult the Oracle ChatGPT and ask about microbiome and digestion, I did this while I was preparing this lecture to think through which topics to cover, and it's actually kind of interesting. It comes up with some good ones. You've got role in digestion, like we've been talking about. So that was ChatGPT's topic pick too, that our gut microbiome is helping us break down complex carbs and fibers and other indigestible foods and producing all these famous healthy fermentation products, which can make for better nutrient absorption and support gut barrier integrity. And then, we've got this gut immune system connection where 70% of our immune cell system resides in our gut. And the microbiome plays an important role in regulating our immune responses. We've got the gut-brain axis. So some of those products of microbial metabolism are reaching our bloodstream and acting as precursors to neurotransmitters. And in fact, 90% of the serotonin in our body is produced in the gut, although it's coming in many cases from the human immune cells in the gut, but they're stimulated by the microbiome. So serotonin production is something that's associated with healthy aging and can be enhanced by having a healthy gut and a healthy gut microbiome. So anyhow, so here's what ChatGPT came up with as the topics to go over. And so I thought that was interesting, and I'm going to highlight a few of my favorite studies. Here's one that highlights the difference in gut microbial diversity depending on geography. And so this is a comparison through age. So the x-axis of this plot is age. So starting with babies at age 0 all the way up to age 80, it's showing you the diversity of microbes in fecal samples in people from the United States, from Amerindia, it's from Venezuela actually, and from Africa and Malawi. And interestingly, you'll notice that the samples in blue, so everybody starts out in this study with low diversity. So when you're born, you don't have a cultivated, diverse community of gut microbes yet. And hopefully in the first year of life, you are getting breast milk and bifidobacteria, breaking down that breast milk. So you actually don't even necessarily want a really diverse microbiome that first year of life. But as you start to eat and get exposures to human gut microbes from family members and community members, then you start to have these big increases in diversity in the first 3 to 5 years of life. And then it plateaus sometime in early childhood. Now notice when you see this plateau in the blue samples from the United States is at an earlier point. So the samples from the people in the United States on average peaked and stayed at around 1,200 different kinds of microbes, whereas the samples from Venezuela and Malawi peak at a much higher number, suggesting that people in other parts of the world are cultivating a more diverse gut microbiome, which in the case of the gut in an adult is associated with health. So this could be related to so many lifestyle factors, so many changes with industrialization. We're eating more processed foods. Many of these are positive for fighting infection and increasing lifespan, but we have access to antibiotics. Those can decrease our gut microbial diversity. We have access to all different kinds of pharmaceuticals. Those can decrease our gut microbial diversity. We're sanitizing our water, which has very positive impact on avoiding diarrheal illness, but it does decrease our exposure to the microbes of our world. So there's a lot of reasons for these decreases in diversity. Household size, for example, and just general increases in hygiene. Number of children in the household can have a big impact on how each child is colonized by microbes. So with this idea about processed food and lack of fiber as one of the main factors leading to decreases in diversity in the industrialized world, a group at Stanford, the Sonnenbergs, they led a really interesting study where in a mouse colony where they were controlling the types of microbes that were present in the colony. They actually colonized the mice with the gut microbiome from a single 30-year-old person. And they colonized this whole colony. And then they withheld fiber for 3 generations. And I'll show you the study design here. And they actually show that as as you get to the second and then third generation, the capacity to break down fiber is being lost in the group of mice that are given a low fiber diet. So if they withhold fiber from the diet, by the second generation, they still have some of the microbes that are important for breaking down the fiber. But by the time you get to the third generation, they have seriously lost some of the microbes that are needed in order to be able to break down the fibers. So it's an interesting parallel to what's happening in our world in the last century. We've had now a couple of generations of eating a lot more processed foods. We started taking the fiber out of flour sometime in the early to mid 20th century for most people living in urban environments. So now it's been a couple generations that we've been having way less fiber consumption compared to most humans in human history. So it's a really interesting point and leads to advice that I've been giving in these talks many times. So you've heard me say it before, but one of the most important things you can do to promote your microbiome health is to eat more fiber. And so we have in the United States a chronic lack of dietary fiber where we're eating maybe half of the daily recommended allowance. And you've heard me point to some of these as favorite ways to increase our fiber intake. So I was surprised to learn actually that avocados are so high in fiber. They're not just high in fat, and the creamy texture from avocados, some of that gooiness is actually fiber, not fat. Think about the texture of oatmeal when you're cooking it fresh. It gets kind of gooey. That's the fiber. Beans are a great source. About half of the carbohydrates in beans are in the form of fiber. Same with berries. Even though they're sweet, they actually have a low glycemic index. They don't spike your blood sugar so much, and they provide a lot of fiber. And then you've heard me talking about chia seeds, which have the highest ratio of fiber to carbs that I'm aware of. And just 2 tablespoons of chia seeds, you can get 12 grams of fiber and fill your fiber gap. And actually, that would be true for a half a cup of lentils too. One thing I really want to spell out clearly is that you really have to manage constipation when you're increasing your fiber intake. And many people have constipation without even realizing it. Some of the indications can be counterintuitive. So it's really important to resolve constipation before increasing fiber intake. And actually, some diarrhea is an indication of constipation. If you have a blockage, then diarrhea can be a symptom of a blockage and having kind of liquid squeezing around a blockage in the intestine. So it's really important to resolve that before adding more fiber. You could make things worse otherwise. And so I'm sharing advice that I have learned both from Dr. Ashish Chogle, a gastroenterology pediatrician at the Children's Hospital of Orange County, and also from a book I really appreciate from Dr. Will Busiewicz. It's called Fiber Fueled. And some of the advice is to you might need to use laxatives to resolve the constipation. Here, the recommendation is to use magnesium or senna-based laxatives and enemas if necessary, and to just make very sure that you've cleared constipation fully before increasing fiber intake. And then on the same lines, fiber without water will become concrete. And I have to credit the artists of the world who contributed to the AI models that let us make these images. But here's an image showing that idea that, if you eat a lot of fiber and you don't add water, that can cause a real blockage. So the benefit of fiber depends on having plenty of water around to help that move through your system. Fiber can be constipating otherwise. And actually, in those class interventions I've told you guys about before in my undergraduate classes here at UCI, when we've done somewhat abrupt changes where we ask people to eat 40 to 50 grams of fiber in a week for 2 weeks, we've really emphasized that you have to drink a lot of water, and some people have experienced some constipation as part of that. So it's better to start slow and to be really sure you're drinking enough water. So yeah, there's my point there. And then I have a few questions here. I know I don't have a way for you to answer. I just want you to think about it. I think a lot of people are taking fiber supplements. So think about that for yourself. Like, under what circumstances are you taking fiber supplements? I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. This is one of the top questions I get is like, is it okay to take fiber supplements? Of course, it's better to get fiber from food. You're better off getting all the associated nutrients you get from eating a diversity of plants. But if you're in a situation where you don't have access to your normal high fiber foods, I think taking supplements can be a really good idea to keep the fiber intake going. You could even view chia seeds almost as a supplement if you were to use that as a regular daily way of making sure you get enough fiber. So that was my question there. And then here's a variant on that question. Do you eat extra fiber while taking antibiotics? Now, while you're taking antibiotics might be the most important time to make sure you're eating enough fiber. When you're eating fiber, you are having foods that persist through your digestion, make it all the way down to the colon where most of your gut anaerobes live. And if you have enough fiber in your colon, you give those anaerobes a place to hide out as antibiotics are coming through. So there have now been multiple studies in people and in mice showing that when you're eating fiber during antibiotic treatment, it can really protect your gut microbiome and avoid infection and other negative outcomes. So it's especially possible if you needed antibiotics for some prophylactic reason, like you have dental treatment that requires antibiotics or surgery. These are times when you could probably make a real effort to make sure that you have enough fiber on board to protect your microbiome while you're getting antibiotics. And then that brings me to my final question here, which is, of the fiber supplement, or of the supplements you might take to resolve constipation, which one do you prefer? These two M words might sound very similar, but actually they are extremely different. Metamucil is fiber. Metamucil is psyllium husk plant fiber, and you can even buy just psyllium husks on their own without the further processing that goes into making Metamucil. And psyllium husks are plants, so that's fiber. That's, still drink plenty of water. The advice about taking Metamucil is the same as it would be for any other plant fiber. And so in my mind, that's a pretty healthy option. Whereas Miralax, which is actually very widely used, some people use Miralax every day. Miralax is not fiber. It's polyethylene glycol. In fact, it can be dehydrating as well. And if you were to compare, like, there have been studies in mice where they compare Metamucil versus Miralax in the context of antibiotic treatment, and they find that the mice in these studies, they do much worse with the Miralax. They're more prone to infection and so forth. So if you're in a position to make this choice, if possible, Metamucil is a much healthier option because it's still fiber. Okay, that brings me to my story about the kidney stones, which I'm excited to tell you about. And, there's little mention of the microbiome in most pharmacology textbooks, although every time you take any drug, it's going to be affected by the microbiome. I mean, we have so many different types of metabolisms encoded in the microbes in our gut. So this story is true for any molecule, whether it came from your diet or from pharmaceuticals. They will have the capacity to be altered and the function impacted by our microbiome. But there's a really interesting story here about a molecule called oxalate and kidney stones. So oxalates are found in our diet, and I I'm not suggesting not to eat oxalate-rich foods unless you have a specific reason not to. These foods are really healthy. So oxalates are found in leafy greens and nuts. Miso, tea is high in oxalates. Chocolate is high in oxalates. So I'm not saying that this is bad. I mean, these are some of the molecules that come along with eating a high fiber, healthy diet. But oxalates do have a role in kidney stone formation. So they can bind with calcium and form crystals that can grow into kidney stones, which are clearly not a good thing, very painful and disruptive. However, we have bacteria in our guts. Actually, many animals have bacteria in their guts, but humans as well. We have gut bacteria that can help break down the oxalates. So if you have cultivated a healthy gut microbiome, you should have microbes in your gut that are helping to break these oxalates down and then protect you from the kidney stone risk. Actually, these are microbes that are sometimes missing when we compare people in the industrialized world, like the United States, with people in other parts of the world. And so that brings me to one of my favorite stories from a professor at the University of Utah, Denise Deering. She has been studying small rodents that live in the Southwest, and she studies how those rodents can live on toxic plants, plants that contain essentially poisons that would not be a good food source if you were just to feed them to a lab rodent, for example. But if you go and study these wild rodents, you find that their gut microbiomes contain microbes that can detoxify poisonous plants. And so she's studied this in the context of several different plant toxins, and one of them is related to oxalates. And so she draws a lot of parallels to human industrialization and loss of microbial diversity, and therefore loss of the capacity to break down plant toxins. So interestingly, if you take one of these wild rats and raise them without the microbes, they are not able to eat toxic creosote bushes that contain plant toxins. But if you colonize these rodents with the gut microbiomes of their wild rodent cousins, then you can actually help them be able to tolerate plants. So part of how rodents are able to survive in harsh environments with foods that are toxic and wouldn't work in other contexts is through the help of the gut microbiome. So this is actually an example of a fecal transplant, which is something you may have heard about in the news, but it's a very old idea. So fecal transplants refer to helping transplant a complete gut microbial community using a fecal sample into the gut of someone or a creature that is missing their gut microbiome. And it's actually a very old idea. The first use of donor feces in a therapeutic context goes back to the 4th century in China. And so there's a few examples of the use of fecal transplants thousands and hundreds of years ago in China, which is really interesting. They would call it golden syrup or yellow soup and use this to help someone who was getting untreatable, unresolvable diarrhea. And I have a favorite story from Stanford in the 1950s, actually, where there was starting to be an observation that people who were having surgery and getting antibiotics for surgery were developing persistent diarrhea after the surgery. And so one of the fathers of the hygiene hypothesis, a man who went on to become a beloved and famous professor at Stanford when he was younger, and he was 23 years old, it was 1957, and he and a surgeon he was working with decided to try to help people to avoid this diarrhea by giving them back their own gut microbiome. Problem is they didn't tell people. So this was the 1950s, before our human ethics boards were as well organized. And so without telling people, they somehow got a fecal sample from them. I don't know how they did that. And they put it into capsules, and they would hide a glycerol capsule full of fecal material in their ice cream. And when they woke up from the surgery, they would feed it to the people, again, without telling them. And it was a big success. They really avoided the antibiotic-associated diarrhea. But they also got fired because when the hospital director found out, that, of course, sounded like a terrible idea. So anyhow, so that's a favorite story about fecal transplants. And an even more modern era, fecal transplants have now become much more common, especially to treat an antibiotic-associated diarrheal infection called Clostridia difficile. And here was a very influential case, and it was reported in the New York Times in 2010, a patient who was suffering with a C. difficile related diarrhea, who was doing terribly. They were really not going to make it. They had diarrhea every 15 minutes. They weighed 60 pounds, couldn't get out of a wheelchair, really not doing well. And this doctor had a creative idea, taking a page from these old stories in China, like, let's try giving a fecal transplant. And they got a fecal sample from her husband, put it in the blender, saline delivered it into her colon, and she got better within 1 day. It made a huge impact. This story was really widely reported. And a clinical trial that happened in the Netherlands the next year reported that the people who were getting the fecal transplant were recovering so quickly that it was unethical not to offer it to the arm of the study that was getting the standard of care, which is just antibiotics. So now we actually do have fecal transplants happening at UCI and around the world. There's a company based in Boston called Biome that has now done something like 60,000 fecal transplants. And that's actually not where the story ends, because these fecal transplants, each one of them is a compassionate use exemption from the FDA. And so really where the story ends is that there are now 2 FDA approved treatments which deliver spores harvested from the feces of healthy people. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with my final few ideas here about how to support a healthy gut microbiome. Really, the message is to do your best to maintain a healthy diet, eating whole foods and making sure to get as much as you can in a healthy way with fiber and fermented foods. And then, of course, all of the other things we know we should do to stay healthy, sleeping, exercising, drinking enough water, all of those things will promote a healthy microbiome as well. I've talked about this before, but just to reiterate, commercial probiotics don't usually have very much evidence to support them, and sometimes are actually associated with negative outcomes. So I don't encourage the use of probiotics. And I also would hope that people can avoid antibiotic overuse. Although, of course, if you need antibiotics, by all means, that's a good idea. And I have a few readings to suggest, some books that many of them are available as audiobooks, exactly, where some of the ideas I've talked about are way better developed in these books. There's even a Netflix series you can watch these days. Okay, so I better pass it over to Jess, make sure there's plenty of time to do the cooking. So I think Jess is going to start out with black bean smash burgers. I see a beautiful plate of black beans over there. And the recipes are available on the website and in your email. And then we've got recipes for invisible layered apple cake and caramel sauce. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and Camber will send these 5 key takeaways to you. Thank you.
There was one question, and I'll give my 2 cents and then you can give your 2 cents. And so the question was about black beans, and they're high in oxalate. One of the saddest things, I think, is when people come in and tell me they can't eat certain things because they hear certain things. Mm-hmm. And one of them being oxalates. And I think that with kidney stones specifically, you really need to work with your doctor, and you need to figure out where it's coming from. So there's things that you can do, obviously, to help reduce some of that oxalate. In beans specifically, it's easy. Soaking them, boiling them. Both of those processes helps eliminate some of it. Even drying beans helps reduce some of it. And so if you're really worried about it, soaking it, boiling it, you're going to reduce at least half of it.
Do you have to dump the water?
You have to dump the water. Yeah. So you do dump the water. You can't use that water anymore. But I would hate for people to eliminate things from their diet because of one little thing. And spinach is always the one that I'm like, no. I always get people leafy greens. They're like, well, I can't have leafy greens because of oxalate. And if you do more readings, there's things that you can add to your diet to reduce the amount of absorption of that oxalate. So calcium and magnesium being the two that if you increase will reduce the amount your body actually absorbs that oxalate. So there's things you can do. So you could have like a spinach omelet. There's different things that you can do to help reduce that then. But we're making a black bean smash burger of all things because we love beans in here, and beans are going to save the world. There was an article, I think, New York Times, and it was. I'm just like shocked at how people are finally picking up that we cannot keep consuming all these meat products. And one of the things that we do eat a lot of is ground beef. Not that there's anything wrong with it. If you can eat it, you can eat it. But how do we reduce some of that meat consumption? Because not only is it hurting your body if you can't have it, it's more also about the sustainability of having meat. Raising meat, whether it be chicken, cattle, pork, all takes quite a lot of energy. And beans don't take that much energy compared to meat. And so if we're talking about sustaining life, this is a lot healthier because it not only is cheaper to grow, it also has all the nutrients inside of it. And so it's trying to change our thinking about what we're putting in our body. One thing might taste good, but one thing is actually feeding us and feeding our body. So when you talk about food, sometimes you got to do that kind of comparison. So we're going to make this burger. And what I did first was I took some beans and I dried them out. So what that means is I just took a can of beans, or if you have fresh beans, I put them in the microwave so they kind of split. So they're dry like this. This is how you get crispy garbanzo beans for those people that want those crispy garbanzo beans but don't want to deep fry them. All you do is put it in the microwave. If you don't want to use your microwave, you can use your oven, and it's only about 6 to 8 minutes, and they begin to split. And that just helps remove some of that excess liquid that's inside of it. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm also going to add jalapeno and mushrooms. So these are cremini mushrooms. And we just did a really cool cooking class on mushrooms. And there's some really cool things about mushrooms that I'm also learning as I teach. One of them being how much more nutritious the brown versus the white mushrooms are just because of them being in the sun. So one of the things that we're trying to get out, like one of the benefits of eating mushrooms are the vitamin D. They get the vitamin D from the sun when they are being raised. And so if you think about it, the browner the mushroom, the more vitamin D content it has. So a white mushroom compared to shiitake mushroom, huge difference. Creminis, baby bellas are also the same. They're nice and brown, meaning they have more vitamin D than the white mushrooms do. So I'm going to add these into my food processor because I'm not going to chop today, really. I'm going to do a rough chop, but not too much. So I put those in there, and then I'm also going to put a jalapeno and some red onion inside. So I'm going to take off this frilly part, but no crazy chopping of any kind, just very rough chop. And you don't have to add the whole jalapeno in if you don't want to, just some of it. And then I'm going to come over here, add these all in, and give it a couple pulses. Or let it go. We had a very successful mushroom class. And so if you're interested, we're going to do more mushroom classes because I think that it's a good way if you are a meat eater and you're trying to figure out how to not eat as much meat. Mushrooms really come close to being like meat. So it's a lot of fun. All right. So I've got this mixture. Some of the mushrooms are large. That's okay. Some of the jalapeno, onions. And this is a great way, excuse me, that jalapeno got me, to add red foods or purple foods into your diet. Red onion has that phytochemical that all purple foods have. So if you're just trying to figure out how do I get purple into my diet, you can use a purple onion. So I'm just going to turn this on, and we're going to saute the onion mixture, the onion and mushroom mixture. And what that's going to do is it's going to kind of release some of those mushroom the mushroom juices or whatever's inside the mushroom and then brown it up. So before I start that, because this takes a little bit of time to heat up, just want to show you that the way that I took care of my mushrooms was I put them on a cookie sheet just like this. I got them wet. I scrubbed off the dirt I could see. There's nothing wrong with taking off the dirt. There's nothing wrong with mushrooms touching water. But then I put the mushrooms on here and I rolled them around. And what that does is it picks up any other loose dirt that might be hanging underneath, might be on the cap. But if I shake them around here, all that paper towel will pick up all that extra stuff. So I've got my oil almost sizzling. Yes, and I'm going to add this in. Okay. So we're going to saute this, and then we're going to mix it with our black beans, and then we're going to smash some burgers. So while this is cooking, we are going to talk about our apple cake, okay? Because this is going to take a little bit of time to saute up. Katrina last month tempted me. I love when people see things on TikTok because I'm not on TikTok or Instagram enough. And so I don't see these things. But she was like, oh, there's this really pretty layered cake. Well, the layered cake she was talking about was very, 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 very intricate and pretty. And so I was like, okay, we need to do a variation that's similar, but at the same time, not too hard. I love making the fruit the centerpiece. So the whole idea is this cake has a lot of apples compared to batter. So what you're going to do is you're going to take apples, and I like I think these are Honeycrisp. You can use anything. Don't think you have to use a green apple. Green apples are great, but they're for tart things. Like unless you really like something tart, there's really no need for it. We're going to slice this apple as thin as you want. Keeping the peel on the apple will, you'll get 22 to 25% of the extra fiber. So if you take it off, in other words, you're going to lose about 25%. And so we're going to just slice this into thin slices. And then you're going to layer it. I'm going to get to the bottom. And then you're going to layer all over the bottom of a loaf pan. We made a circle, but you can do this in whichever form you want. And if you think about it, you can use any kind of fruit in the sense of it being like an apple, pear, stone fruit even. Like if you like pears, you can even do that. So we're going to keep going around. I'm going to have my students help me chop up some apples so we can get these going. Can you guys help me? Each take an apple. I should have done that ahead of time. Don't worry. We already have one made up for you too, so we can show you what it looks like. But we're going to get this going. Katrina's going to take one too. Perfect. You can use a mandolin too if you want to be really fancy with this. But what I really think is fun is the types of apples that you can get to make this. And it literally just becomes this full cake of apples. So while they're working on the apples for us, we're going to make our batter. So I'm a fan of white whole wheat flour, if you can find it. Albertsons usually has it, and it's a nice flour because it looks white, but it's actually whole wheat. It grows more white than other flours do, and so it has a tendency to trick us into thinking that it's actually a white flour. Add some cinnamon, baking powder.
Can you repeat the name of the flour? I didn't.
Oh, white whole wheat.
White whole wheat.
White whole wheat. King Arthur makes it. They used to have another brand that made it, and I guess they didn't sell too well, and so they don't make it anymore.
Oh.
The problem with whole wheat flour most of the time is it's really coarse. It has a tendency to be coarse, and so when you bake things, they're not light and fluffy. Mm-hmm. White whole wheat, for some reason, isn't as strong of it's not as hearty of a strain, I guess, and so it does not. You don't have any problems. It's nice and light. All right. And then we've got some milk. You can use any kind of milk that you like. You can use almond milk, soy milk. But my trick is this for people. If you are like me and like really, really, really fluffy things sometimes, and you know you're going to be adding baking soda or baking powder, try buttermilk. Why? Buttermilk is acidic. And because buttermilk is acidic, when it comes into contact with the baking soda or baking powder, it fluffs more. So if you ever make pancakes and you use buttermilk versus regular, you'll notice how much fluffier it is. Just put it all over. Yes. So then we've got a little bit of the egg. Oops. I'm going to do it over here. I would usually use a whisk. You don't need to worry about this batter. It's a pretty thin batter, so you can mix it all together. If you don't want to use egg, you can use a flaxseed. Again, all of these things that are in here are to bind the apples together. So it's not too much that you're adding. It's just there to bind it all together. And there you go. And then we're going to make a little crumble topping to put right on top. And then you've got this beautiful apple cake. So we're going to finish that in 1 minute because we forgot the most important part, which is the sugar. So I'm going to add my sugar in. We're using date sugar. You can use what sugar you want. I wouldn't mess around too much with the amount of sugar because it's pretty close. Yay! All these pretty apple slices.
I just went on autopilot and cut them the way I do for my
Yeah,
kids.
no, that's perfect. That's perfect. Nice.
I learned a trick, the way you leave the apple slice down when you cut the core
Cut
out.
it, yeah.
I usually do dangerous things.
I know. I was like, one day, the apple scares me sometimes. Apple cuts are not fun. All right. So my mixture here has released its liquid. So the mushrooms have kind of released their liquids. They're good to go now. And we're going to come back and finish our burgers after we finish our apples. Okay. Sorry to go back and forth today. We got a lot going on. Okay. So for our black bean burger, I'm going to add our black beans inside our food processor. And then I'm going to add my mushroom mixture inside. The other things I'm going to add inside, garlic powder. Oops. It was in the refrigerator. Garlic powder, cumin, smoked paprika, and a little bit of liquid aminos or soy sauce. Up to you. And then our binder, which is our oats, if there's room. Yeah, just squish down. So we're going to add the oats in there as well. Oats are a great substitute for breadcrumbs. So if you have a recipe that calls for breadcrumbs, you can use oats in replace as a binder. And that's all there is. So we're just going to take this mixture out now.
We got a question about what is a good egg replacer, and I think you answered it talking about flaxseed.
I think a flaxseed for this would definitely work very well. So you can just use a flaxseed. So it's 1 tablespoon of flaxseed to 3 tablespoons of water. Oops, I just dropped that.
I learned something really interesting about eggs recently.
Mm,
I was teaching general micro and about salmonella, which you find salmonella in about 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 20,000 eggs in the United States.
hmm.
But it's actually been eradicated in Denmark. So in some places,
Really?
they don't have to worry about
Salmonella?
you can eat raw eggs because since 2018, there's been no salmonella in the egg.
Wow.
And if you want to pasteurize an egg, but keep its raw texture so that you can eat it raw,
Yeah,
you just have to hold it at 140 degrees Celsius for a few
for
minutes.
a few minutes.
Yeah, so we've done
That
that
makes
recently.
sense. I grew up eating raw eggs, and so I still eat them raw here. And so
Well,
I yeah, and what I do, I use it with like hot pot and stuff like that. And what I'll do is whatever I'm using is hot, and then I'll dip it into the egg. And so the whole idea is like the egg, it'll hold it.
yeah.
And so okay, so now comes the beautiful part of pouring this batter all over it. Okay. It takes some time, takes some patience, but you're just going to go slowly around. And even if you wanted to start excuse me, adding some batter halfway through, you could. So this is going to take some time. And then I'm just going to pour it and then put it into the oven. The whole idea is the apples are going to soften up, right? And then the batter is going to come up right around the edge of it. And you probably could use this as a smaller loaf pan than I should have used, but really get in there. And again, patience is key when you're baking sometimes.
Do you have any opinions about the difference between baking soda and baking powder?
Yes. Yes. So baking soda only reacts to acid and liquid, whereas baking powder is, have you ever seen the word double acting on it? It means it's reacting based off um, heat and liquid. So what that means is baking powder, anything that requires baking powder, actually both of them, baking soda and baking powder, both of those things start acting as soon as they come in contact with the liquid. That's why when you're baking something, as soon as you add baking soda and baking powder, you have to get it into the oven. You can't let it sit because else it won't puff up. It won't do that active, it won't get nice and big on you that you want. So if you have a recipe that's baking soda only, you definitely want to get it into the oven as quickly as possible. Baking powder, that double action, sometimes gives you a little bit more leeway.
Interesting.
Yeah. Um, if somebody might ask, is there's aluminum in some baking powders? And so you can buy it without aluminum. I don't know what the reason why they add aluminum into it is, but there is. And so then we're going to make a crumble topping. Got some cold butter and some sugar and more flour. And so this is how you normally would do a crumble. It's funny. I'm going to say this, and I know I have no scientific evidence about this, but in the baking world, I've always been taught, like ever since I was in culinary school, that females tend to have higher body temperatures. I Is that true? I don't compare to males.
We just recently revised what average body temperatures
Yeah.
are,
Uh-huh.
and they've gone down since like 150 years ago.
Oh, wow.
There is a small difference.
There is, right?
Interesting.
I wonder. So one of the things it was that a lot of bakers tend to be men if you look at it. And the reason is because, well, we were taught this. This was, again, when I was in culinary school, that men tend to have colder hands. And because their hands can stay colder longer, when they come in contact with things like butter, chocolate, they don't disintegrate as fast. And so a lot of female bakers that I knew ended up having to work inside walk-in freezers because they couldn't keep their hands cold enough. Everything they touched would just disintegrate. And so, I again don't know the science behind it, but I've always been interested, like this body heat and how it does affect bakers. Like for baking, temperatures are very, very interesting, including something like this, where you want to keep the butter cold so that it flakes nicely. Same as croissants, things like that. You would want to make sure they're nice and pretty. So now I'm just going to crumble this all over the top. And again, if you're doing this and you're using a pan like mine that looks like it's going to be too small, put it on another pan before you put it in your oven because it might spill over. So, but don't worry, I've got a beautiful one ready to show you. So I'm going to put this in the oven. All right. And then this is the beautiful, we made it into a circle though for this one, just to get more so you could see more. But then it's this beautiful cake that when I cut through, I'm going to cut through. So it's very crunchy almost. You've got this beautiful layer of just layers and layers of apples. And so if you think about it, you're not really eating cake, you're eating layer upon layer of apple. It's really pretty.
That's really cool.
So if you really wanted to make a sauce for this, you could take some dates. I got time. I got time to show you both things. I've got some soaked dates, okay? About a cup. I'm not going to use the water. It just helps to soak them, to soften them up a little bit. I'm not saying this is healthy in the sense of, okay, so regular caramel sauce is sugar and butter, right? Melted down. I'm going to use brown rice syrup or maple syrup. Either one is okay. And then I'm still using a fat. I'm just using coconut. So I don't want you to think that this is healthy. It's just different, okay? It's less processed ingredients. It's dairy-free, not that the cake was, but it's just another variation, and it's faster than making caramel from scratch because I'm not going to have to, I don't have to turn on the stove. What I wanted to show you is I purposely kept this can of coconut milk in the refrigerator to show you that the coconut cream is just the stuff on top, okay? Not the stuff underneath. So I like keeping coconut milk in the refrigerator because it does this. Now, what that means is we just had a cooking class this morning. What that means is stop buying light coconut milk because at the end of the day, you're just paying for water. I'm going to get there soon because I just want the cream from this. I don't want anything else. And what you'll notice is that when you usually buy good brand coconut, it will have a large amount of cream, and then that's all the water. Now, you could use that water later on if you wanted to thin this out. I'm going to take this and blend. I'm going to add a little bit. And there you are. So you've got this beautiful cream sauce that you can just add on top of your cake if you want. It's sweet enough as is, but if you wanted to, you could. So let's smash some burgers. If you've never smashed a burger before, this is all you do. I'm going to heat up a pan, and then I'm going to make 8 patties out of this. My pan is hot already because I kept it in my oven. It's just a regular cast iron that I'm going to now add oil to. Okay. I'm going to put in 4 balls. 1, 2, I might only get 3. You don't want to overcrowd your pans. There you go. Okay. Now I'm going to grab technically what would be nicer if it was completely sealed. Mine isn't. Mine's just a fish spatula, but I'm just going to smash it. You can even take like a wooden spoon to it. The whole idea is I'm going to smash it now. Okay. That's it. If you want, you can add some cheese. I've got some cheese on here, but I'm not going to add the cheese until I flip it. And that's it. We have a sauce recipe in there for you that's got some mayo, yogurt, dill pickles. So if you want, you can add those inside too. But then you've got this burger that acts pretty much like a regular hamburger. Use a fish spatula, flip it around, slap some cheese on top of it. That's it. Any other questions? If not, thank you so much for hanging out with us. We'll try to get some of these prepared and some pictures online too. And we will see you next month. Dr. Janab will be here. So that should be a lot of fun of our naturopath. So we'll see you next month. Bye.
Great. Take care. Bye.